He raised his glass and smiled at me across the banquet hall, and I knew, right then, the way you know a storm is coming before a single cloud appears, that he had no idea who I was. That smile, easy practice, the kind a man wears when he spent 50 years being the most important person in every room. He was about to toast his son's new bride, my daughter, and he was going to use that moment to put me in my place in front of every single person she'd ever loved. What he didn't know was that I had a manila envelope in my purse, and I had been waiting 23 years to open it. Let me go back to where it started. Not the beginning of my life, but the beginning of the part that matters to this story. I was 31 years old when my husband died in a refinery accident in eastern Texas. My daughter was 4. She used to climb into the pocket of his work jacket and pretend she was hiding from wolves. She was small enough that she actually fit. After the funeral, his family stopped calling within 3 months. My family was far away and had their own difficulties. What I had was a 4-year-old girl with her father's dark eyes, a 2-bedroom apartment with a leaking bathroom pipe, and a bookkeeping certificate from the community college I'd attended before we got married. I found work. That's the part people summarize in one sentence. But it took 6 weeks of phone calls and interviews and asking neighbors to watch my daughter, and one afternoon sitting in my car in a parking lot crying until I couldn't cry anymore, and then driving home because she needed dinner. I got a position at a mid-sized construction company keeping their accounts. The pay was not generous, the hours were long. My daughter learned to fall asleep on the floor of my office on a folded blanket while I reconciled invoices. Her name was not important in the video you may have watched about someone else. But her name is important to me. I named her after my grandmother, who crossed an ocean alone at 19 and arrived in this country speaking 4 words of English and built something anyway. I thought that was the right inheritance to give a child. She grew up in the passenger seat of my car, eating crackers from a sleeve, singing along to the radio. She grew up learning to make rice and beans because I taught her. She grew up knowing that money was something we thought about carefully, and that careful thought was not the same as poverty. It was its own kind of competence. I was proud of her. That is not complicated. I was proud of her every single day. What I kept from her, what I kept from everyone, was the other part of my life. The thing I had been carrying since before she was old enough to understand it. 3 months after my husband's funeral, I received a box of his personal belongings from the job site. In the bottom, under his gloves and a photograph and a pocket knife, was a folded piece of paper, a copy of an internal incident report. 2 pages, handwritten, dated 2 weeks before the accident. That report documented a known structural failure in the storage unit where he died. A failure that had been flagged by a site inspector and dismissed by the operations manager. The dismissal was signed. I read that name. I read it until I had memorized every letter. The name was Hartwick, Leonard Hartwick, regional operations director for the contracting firm that had hired my husband's crew. I took that paper to a lawyer. The lawyer told me I had something, but that these cases took years and money I didn't have, and that the company's legal team would bury me. He was not wrong about any of that. I couldn't fight them then. I had a 4-year-old and a leaking pipe and $6 in checking. But I kept the paper. I kept the copy of the report. I kept the name. I told myself I was keeping it for justice. Later, I understood I was keeping it because letting go of it would have meant admitting there was nothing I could do, and I was not ready to admit that. Years passed. My daughter grew. She was not a dramatic child. She was steady and observant, the kind of person who notices things quietly and files them away. She got good grades without being pushed. She had friends I liked and a few I didn't, and she handled both situations with more grace than I had at her age. She went to a state university 2 hours away on a partial scholarship and a loan and money I had been setting aside in a coffee can since she was 9 years old. Literally a coffee can. I didn't trust myself not so much as a savings account. She called me every Sunday. That was her rule, not mine. Every Sunday at 7 in the evening, without fail, my phone would ring. When she was 26, the Sunday calls started to have a different quality. She was lighter, laughing more. There was something she wasn't saying, and I recognized it because I had once felt it myself. That particular happiness that belongs to early love when everything is new and the other person hasn't disappointed you yet and the world seems to have rearranged itself into a kindness. I asked her once directly, "Are you seeing someone?" "Mom," she said, "I'll tell you when there's something to tell." I let it go. She was 26, not 16. I had raised her to have her own life, and that was what she was doing. 6 months later, she called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. She said she needed to talk to me in person. She drove home that weekend. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table we had shared for 20 years, the one with the ring stain from I could never get out. And she told me she was engaged. I felt the joy first, pure and immediate, the way a grandmother describes it in a movie. which I always thought was sentimental until it happened to me and I understood that some feelings are simply true. Then she said his last name. I heard it the way you hear a sound in a wall at night. Something small and wrong that you can't immediately identify. Hartwick, I asked her to repeat it. She did. I sat with that for a moment. Hartwick was not an uncommon name. There was no reason to assume. I asked her carefully what his father did for work. She told me. Infrastructure development. Had been in the industry for 30 years. I asked his father's first name. Leonard, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. What I did not do in that moment was tell her. I want you to understand why, because this is the part people find hardest to accept. I had one piece of paper and a name. I did not have a case. I did not have confirmation. I did not know if this Leonard Hartwick was the same man, if his signature on a dismissal order 23 years ago could be proven, or if bringing this to my daughter would destroy her happiness over something I could not yet prove and could never undo. I told myself I needed to think. I told myself I would figure it out. I told myself a lot of things. What I did was say congratulations and asked to see the ring. She showed me. It was lovely. I told her it was lovely. I meant it. She drove home that evening. I sat at the kitchen table until the room went dark and I didn't bother to turn on the lights. Over the next 4 months, I did what I should have done 20 years earlier. I hired an investigator, not expensive, a retired police officer who did background work on the side. I gave him the incident report and the name. I told him what I needed. What he found was not a surprise, but seeing it written down was something different from suspecting it. Leonard Hartwick had signed the dismissal of that inspection report. There was a paper trail, buried but there. A civil lawsuit had been filed by the families of 2 other workers injured in the same period. It had been settled quietly with NDAs in 2009. The investigator found one of the attorneys who had represented those families. He would not say much, but he said enough. I sat with this information. I thought about going to my daughter. I thought about what it would do to her. To learn that the man she was about to marry into a family was connected, however indirectly, however legally murkily, to the accident that had taken her father. I made the wrong choice. I know that now. I kept quiet. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself I needed more time to figure out the right way. The wedding date was set for the following April. I bought a dress. I made a speech at the rehearsal dinner. I smiled at Leonard Hartwick across a table and shook his hand and said it was wonderful to meet him. And he looked through me the way powerful men look through women they have decided are not interesting. He didn't know my name. He had never known my name. I was just the mother of the bride, the widow, the woman who worked in accounting. The wedding was held at a hotel ballroom in the city. My daughter was luminous. Her husband, my son-in-law, a genuinely kind young man who had nothing to do with any of this, looked at her the way my husband had once looked at me, and I found myself grateful for that even in the middle of everything else. The toasts began after dinner. Leonard Hartwick stood up first. He spoke about his son. He spoke about the family they were welcoming. He spoke about legacy and values and what it meant to build something that lasts. He was a good speaker, practiced, comfortable, the kind of man who had given hundreds of toasts in hundreds of rooms. And then he looked at me, directly at me, and he said something that the microphone carried to every corner of that room. He said, "Of course we don't know much about where she comes from. A woman who raised a daughter alone. Well, we can admire the effort, even if the circumstances are a little." He paused and smiled, and the smile was the worst part. Modest. Laughter. Not everywhere, but enough. My daughter's face. I will not describe what happened in my chest in that moment because some things are not for describing. What I will tell you is that my hands were completely steady when I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. I said, "Leonard, before you sit down, I'd like to say something." He looked surprised, then amused. He gestured at the microphone as if granting me permission. I reached into my purse. I took out an envelope. I had carried it for 23 years in various forms, sometimes a folder, sometimes a box, sometimes just a memory. But that night it was a standard manila envelope sealed with a copy of every document my investigator had compiled. I said calmly and clearly for everyone in that room to hear. In April of 2001, a structural failure at a refinery job site in eastern Texas killed 3 workers and injured 4 more. An inspection report documenting that failure was filed 2 weeks before the accident. It was The dismissal was signed by the regional operations director. I looked at him. "Your name, Leonard, is on that document. One of the men who died was my husband, my daughter's father." The room did not make a sound. I said, "I have spent 23 years wondering what the right moment was. I don't know if this is it, but I know this: the word modest will never describe what it took to raise her without him." I set the envelope table in front of me. I sat down. Leonard Hartwick's face had gone a color I don't have a word for. What followed was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. My daughter did not speak to me for 11 months. I have to be honest about this part, even though it is painful, because the people who watched the other version of this story and were angry at a mother for cutting off her child, I want you to understand that it works both ways. She was angry. She had a right to be. I had kept something from her. I had known for months. I had smiled at that man across the rehearsal dinner table while holding 23 years of documentation in a folder at home. She felt betrayed. I was betrayed by my own fear. We had both chosen silence for what felt like the right reasons, and we had both paid for it. She called me 11 months later, not on a Sunday, on a Wednesday morning early. She said she had been talking to a counselor, and she had been talking to her husband, and she had been trying to understand something that did not have a clean answer. She said, "I don't know if I can forgive you for not telling me, but I understand why you didn't, and I need you back." I said, "I'm already here. I never went anywhere." The legal questions are still unresolved, and that is the honest truth. The documents exist. The attorney from the 2009 settlement has been in contact with a journalist. Whether anything comes of it depends on things I cannot control. I have made peace with not controlling it. What I have is my daughter. What I have is a grandson, born 7 months after she called me on that Wednesday morning, small and serious-faced, and already somehow possessed of his great-great-grandmother's quality of noticing things quietly and filing them away. I held him for the first time, and I thought about a 4-year-old climbing into the pocket of a work jacket. I thought about a coffee can full of small bills. I thought about a folded piece of paper at the bottom of a box of belongings, and how strange it is that the things we carry shape us in ways we couldn't have chosen. He reached up and grabbed my finger and held on with a grip that surprised me. "You've got something," I told him. I can already tell he didn't let go, neither did I.